Hi everyone, welcome to a tactics video again. This time looking at how to use Astra Militarum Imperial Guard indirect units like artillery. This is a video in a series of videos where I look at how to actually use the units, not the individual units themselves, but more conceptually the unit as what it does on the tabletop for you. So a bit about my channel, if you don't know, is I'm a true variety hub covering everything from the Astra Militarum lore, tactics like this video here where I bring a relaxed but a competitive approach to 40k. And also building, assembling, and kit bash videos as well. Ex-military member from the Australian Army many years ago, so I bring a unique aspect to Astra Militarum. And as I said, I'm a competitive player, but bringing a really relaxed approach to it. So as I said, this is a series of videos I've done. I've looked at battle line, battle tanks, Limrus battle tanks, and also other units like Tempestus Signs as well. There's a link somewhere here, whichever side it appears. Now, we are in the middle of the new Codex launch, so you can buy the Codex right now on the 21st of January. You can buy it in a launch box, but if you want to get the actual Codex by itself, which I do, you've got to wait another probably 3 or 4 weeks or so. But that being all said, what I'm going to be looking at is largely the new units. Individual units do, but more just to list them out. And for those who are eagle-eyed, you'll notice 2 exceptions here that aren't here anymore, is the Earthshaker Carriage Battery and the Medusa Carriage Battery, both Forge World options, resin units, which have been removed from the official rules. So what you're seeing here is the new points for those units that are left in the new Codex. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The artillery team, which is the new Def Corps massive model. That's 3 options there. I can't tell you which ones, but there's 3 options. There's the Basilisk, which is a vehicle. There's the Cadian or Catagen Heavy Weapons Squad. There's also a Def Corps of Creek Heavy Weapons Squad, but they don't have any indirect units options. They've got Heavy Flamer, Las Cannon, Heavy Stubber. But the Cadian Catagens can both take mortars, which obviously are indirect. The Deathstrike missile, which basically remains a meme. It was good in 9th edition briefly, now in 10th it's just pointless. Still cool though. The Field Ordnance Battery, which basically is the Cadian version of the artillery team. You get the Bombast field gun. The Manticore, which is the Storm Eagle rockets, and also the Wyvern, which is the quad mortar launcher. So, as I said, I won't focus on what individual ones do. But you can see the points there. They are by no means hyper cheap. Of course, heavy weapon teams are cheap 50 points for 3 bases, 3 mortar tubes. And definitely, broadly speaking, is that they continue to have a good spot within any meta because they're just dirt cheap. 3d6 for 50 points, just plinking rounds off, albeit Strength 5 AP0 damage 1. Can do nothing against certain matchups, and we'll touch on that. But into other matchups, it can do a lot of work into sort of lightly armored opponents. Now, before we get into the actual sort of structure of the video, which I always do, is just remember that the core rules of 40k. So in the current ruling, at the 21st of January, whatever it is, in the 2025, is that indirect can only hit on 4+. Yeah, that's the best you can hit on. You can re-rolls, of course, but hitting on 4s is a blanket rule. So if you've been playing for a while, you'll know that back at the beginning of 10th edition, you could make Astra Militarum indirect hit on 2s, reroll 1s with lethal hits, and that was just absurd. That is now gone, so the best you can hit on now is 4s with some rerolls, of course. Now that mathematically obviously means you only hit 50% of the time. So that basically means that any data sheet you look at, D6 plus 3, D6 plus 1, D6, you need to already do some mental mathematics that if the average you roll on a D6 is 4, on average you're going to get 2 hits. Yeah, and then you've got to understand the wound roll and the saving throw. So already mathematically, you can basically look at any data sheet and go, it's 50% of the maximum output. 50% of that's actually going to hit the target. Now the other ruling, of course, is that indirect attacks always give the target unit the benefits of cover. So very simply, when you look at a data sheet, if it's AP2, it's basically AP1 because they get cover. If it's AP0, then depending on the opponent's armor save, they could go down to a 3+ if they've got a 4+ save, or even a 5+ save, they go to a 4+ save. So already we are fighting math the wrong way, because the best you can have is a 4, and your opponent always gets a benefit of cover. That's if you're shooting indirect. Now, of course, across any of these data sheets, if you manage to move them so they can see direct line of sight, suddenly they don't get cover, and then you are not getting, then you could be hitting on better than a 4s. And there are certain units here which later do that more so than others. So, for example, a Basilisk, a Manticore and a Wyvern, obviously are vehicle models, so they can move around much easier than a Field Ordnance Battery, which moves, I think, 4. Acadian Catagen heavy weapon team, they can move 6 inches, but definitely they're going to find it, they can't move as far than a Basilisk or a Manticore. Granted, they're infantry, they can move through walls, etc. But just basically think that, if you need to be looking at your opponent with these indirect units, either it's pretty desperate or you want to chuck and maximize their output. Another thing to remember obviously consider the points here is, I would say broadly, given you're hitting on 4s, you can reroll 1s in some regimental detachments, some detachment rules. Is that if you want to make this work, either you just take 1 or 2 to annoy your opponent to sort of pick on things, or you go fully into it and then you basically spend a fair amount of points. The best way to sort of remove any mathematical challenges like hitting on 4s is just to take more stuff. There is a certain quality and quantity. So the more you take of this type of thing, the more the chances of obviously hitting. Now that will tie directly into some key points I'm going to make, which is basically think any points you put into artillery, which are going to spend the majority of the game behind cover, plinking shots off at your opponent, aren't playing the rest of 40k. Yeah, so they're not going to be out there contesting objectives, scoring secondaries like containment or cleanse or behind enemy lines, God forbid. That type of thing is that if you're putting 500 points into indirect, that's 500 points that's not going to play the rest of the game. And then you basically rely upon that purely to destroy your opponent's stuff. So that's a really key thing. Given we're only hitting on 4s with some rerolls, in some instances, the mathematical output of these units is pretty limited, but that all being said, it can tie into a wider game plan and approach to 40k. So like the other videos, I basically touch on what won't they do, what will they do, go through some key themes and finish with a summary. Now in the other videos, I typically go to Tabletop Simulator for some props and some illustrations, but given this is pretty basic, there's no need to sort of show you physically what the models will do. It's just best to talk through it. So as always, what won't they do? Yeah, so as I just said, any points you put into units which sit the entire game at the back of the board, shooting away at your opponent and they can't see them, won't score you many victory points with a massive asterisk there. Now, obviously, as I said, they can't score primary unless they're sitting on an objective, obviously, or they can't score secondaries, like containment, for example. But what they can do is obviously they can achieve kill secondaries. In the mission Purge the Foe, they can also contribute to that mission where you get victory points for killing your opponent's stuff. So again, if you get Assassinate and there's one single character running around that isn't lone op, you hit it with artillery, you achieve Assassinate. Likewise, no prisoners or even overwhelming force, a secondary objective where you get to kill stuff on an objective. So they can score you victory points, but not as easily as other units, yeah? Now the other way they can score you victory points, yeah, is that if you are basically removing pieces of your opponent's army from actually existing, that is a way to score victory points, because the less units your opponent has, just like with yourself, the less points you can score, because you've got less stuff to do that, obviously. But broadly speaking, always think about the fact that if you're going to put points into indirect, which sit in the backfield all game, they're not going to score you many victory points, broadly speaking. Yeah, compared to, say, Limb and Rice Battle Tank, they can block lots of stuff and sit on objectives, they can survive all game, or even some battle line dudes, 10 bodies at OC2 becomes OC3, suddenly turning off objectives left, right, and center. Okay, they won't reliably kill stuff. Yeah, and like everything in this type of thing, is I will put caveats everywhere, and then I actually will repeat the same statement of what they can do. But Guard broadly is an army where you can't rely upon things to kill things. Yeah, because we typically hit on 4s, sometimes hit on 3s. You get rerolls in some instances, and you can make indirect reroll 1s in some detachments, and also with some supported units like Scout Sentinels. But given you're hitting on 4s, as I said, that removes the math, that's 50% less hits. And given the majority of the all of the indirect units are a D6 plus something, or a D6 blast, is infamously you'll get to know when you play enough 40k of Guard, is that you may simply roll one shot on your D6, you might get 2 with blast, and then you've got hitting on 4s, you roll 1, and you've got suddenly 1 shot which hit, and then they go to the wound roll and the save throw, and suddenly you don't do any damage. So that's the thing, is currently I would not comfortably think that you can blast your opponent off the tabletop. That said, if you spend 1,000 points and you go wild and indirect, which I've not seen in a while, you did that, you could probably blast your opponent off the tabletop. But then that'll tie into basically what I said before, which is what is actually going to play the rest of the game for you, whilst everything is just hammering your opponent. Now, they won't survive unsupported. Broadly speaking, across all of the data sheets we've got here, nothing here is super tanky. Yeah, they're not Leman Russ battle tank equivalents. There were some, interestingly, there was the Praetor launcher, which was a Forge World kit. Long live that, because I bought it and it's now dead. So had a 2-up save, but across all of this stuff, infantry, 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 they've all got like 5-up or 4-up saves. They're all toughness 3 or 4. The Wyvern, the Manticore, and the Basilisk and the Deathstrike got 3-up saves, but you know, if these things get hit by the right amount of DACA, they will blow up or just get turn into mincemeat. Also within that, you know, they and when you say unsupported, that obviously means not getting shot, but also within the overall game stat, they need numerous layers of screens to protect them from actually getting to be hit. Now, as I keep going on, this point will come to life is, you know, they can't win games unsupported. So again, if you talk 1,500 points of indirect, I don't know if you can even do that. If you've only got 500 points of scoring units, you're probably going to lose the game anyway. Sure, you may blow your opponent off the tabletop, and by the time you get to turn 5, they've got nothing left, but they probably would have just scored maximum primary in turns, you know, 2, 3, and 4, scored all the secondaries, and they've got nothing left, and they still win the game. Yeah, because definitely, you know, winning 40k, and this is obvious once you say it, but you know, it's about scoring points, not surviving. You know, it's obviously a balance. You don't want to die too quickly, but if you're scoring more than your opponent, you're winning the game. You might finish on with one model, you've won the game. Now, this of course has a caveat: you won't reach the entire board of all of these units. Basically, I think the key thing is across the infantry indirect, their range is broadly 48 inches. Now, in certain missions, depending on the deployment, you may not actually touch the entire board. Certainly, I think it's in the diagonal deployment, there is certainly an instance where if you're deployed on your home objective, shooting to your opponent's home objective, unless you push the artillery quite forward, you could actually not be fully in range. Now, of course, things like the Manticore and the Basilisk, they've got like ridiculous ranges of like 120 inches, 240 inches, so you can shoot into your neighbour's backyard type of things, so no issues there. But do remember that, particularly for the infantry data sheets, they're typically at 48, and that does mean some parts of the board are safe from your fire, your indirect fire. So what will they do? They will create a war of attrition. Yeah, so if you're an opponent just played non-interactive 40k for 5 turns, you would basically probably win, yeah, within reason, because you know you can just consistently hit them over and over again for 5 turns, and if they don't come out and attack you, you're just going to have more stuff left. So that definitely is one to think about. It's a real positive of this, is that it puts your opponent on the clock, because even in turn 1, which typically in turn 1, it's all about positioning. There's not much shooting occurring or charging. Is even in turn 1, you're plinking off a couple of models. That's still a couple of models less they have than you do when they go into the second turn. So you are basically putting them on a clock. Now, as said, they will kill some stuff. The big thing is some stuff. Now, broadly speaking, if your opponent's got power armor 3-up save, you're hitting them with AP1 or AP0, they're on a 3-up save, you know, you're probably going to bounce most. They're probably going to bounce most of those. Now, clearly, with the majority of these these indirect units having the blast keyword, your ideal target is obviously massive blobs of infantry, you know, like 20 with blast 4, ideally with a 5-up save or a 6-up save, and ideally like, you know, a toughness 3 or 4, so where you're wounding on a 3 and they're saving maybe on a 4 or 5. That's when you can actually do a lot of work. Now, matchup wise, that's obviously going to be like maybe orcs who don't have much of an armor save and come in big blobs, Tyranids, maybe Tau with Kroot, other Astra Militarum commanders, because the mirror match will be quite common in the current state of 40k for Astra Militarum. And then there'll be other ones out there which I can't name. But I think another way to think about it is if you're going into a tournament and you come into a Space Marine player, then you're like, well, you know, I'm not going to do a load of damage in my indirect because I've got power armor. But that being said, they can do some damage into the right targets. And of course, across all of this stuff here, like, you know, the artillery team have got, I think, a strength 12, AP2, I think flat 3 damage. Field Ordnance Batteries, I think, is 712. I don't actually know what the Manticore is in the new codex, but I assume it's quite powerful. But some of these will plink away at vehicles. they'll give them that is enough of a high strength and AP and enough damage to plink off vehicles. But what you want to be putting most of these into is enemy infantry. Yeah, that's what you broadly want to be putting it into. Yeah. So as I said there, which ties into the war of attrition, is you're forcing your opponent to react, and you can play uninteractive Warhammer. Yeah, now that's not to say it's fun to play. I definitely say at the beginning of 10th edition, when the guard index attachment was so rubbish, where you got lethal hits if you remain stationary, you could make Astra Militarum to hit on 2s, reroll 1s via Scout Sentinels old rule. That probably wasn't good for the game of 40k. It didn't feel like a nice way to play 40k, but if you were quite competitive, that was the only way to play Astra Militarum, because you could just literally blast your opponent off a tabletop. So as I said, you can basically play a very cagey game and basically force your opponent to react. Yeah. Now, saying they are going to react, you need to then think about how you manage their reaction. Yeah, because let's pretend you're playing World Eaters and you slam them with artillery, 700 points of artillery, you blow up all their backfield, for example. Firstly, how do you maximize that massive hole in the backfield? Are you bringing scions or accolons? And then how are you reacting to the fact they basically push forward their entire army to basically get in your mixer and sort of, turn off your primary? Now, of course, that means nowhere on the board is safe. Now, this is again tied into the range discussion. 48 inches won't cover the entire board. And also, if your opponent has got lone op, obviously they're untouchable, yeah, because they can't be targeted outside of 12 inches. But this obviously, particularly, this is always just to think about if you're newer to 40k or playing newer opponents, this will actually instill an element of fear. And I mean, we're talking about tour soldiers, but there is a mental game to all of this. If your opponent suddenly sees you take, like, I don't know, 3 artillery teams, three field ordnance batteries, and 3 Cadian heavy weapon squads, then they'll be like, oh, okay, well, actually, I'm going to lose a lot of stuff without you having to pay for it. Yeah, because ultimately, as I said, this is basically killing your opponent's stuff at no cost to yourself, because you're not interacting with them. You just blast them, they can't do anything about it. So this definitely will make some opponents react a certain way. And I would still harp on the point that it's not a fun way to play 40k. But it's the way to play 40k for Astra Militarum currently in some scenarios. Now, they will also screen your backfield. This, I'd say, for guard, it should never be an issue. You should never be sort of receiving deep strike into your backfield, because guard typically have got loads of units. Even against 6-inch deep strike, which is now a thing, you should be okay, because you've got loads of units to sort of sit around and do things. But again, you could, if you take 500 points of Astra Militarum artillery, that's 500 points that are fully screen the back of the board out, and then you can have full confidence you're not going to get deep struck onto your objective, and everything else pushes out in place the game of 40k and scores you loads of points. Now, a fun one is then, it really will make you feel like you're playing and fighting in the Astra Militarum Imperial Guard, because there's nothing like the good old feel of artillery going over the top of the infantry squads, the Cadians, the Catechins, the Def Corps, as they advance forward, living us behind them. So thematically, it is very sort of in tune with Astra Militarum. And I always like to think that, 38,000 years away, we're still using like what essentially is gunpowder weaponry to fight aliens and get traitor Astartes. So there's always that fun as well. Cool, let's now get onto some key themes. And as I said, I'm not using TTS in this example because I don't think I need it, because they're all sort of discussion points. So, okay, maximizing backfield screening. So I just spoke about the fact that you've got 500 points of artillery that are going to spend most of the game sat behind cover. Yeah, you want to have this stuff behind cover broadly, so it's hidden from line of sight shooting. And you want to basically spread it out across your entire deployment zone. Now, that also being said, depending on the deployment zone, if you start off with whatever the 2 corner deployments are concerned, that could be quite squishy. Is maybe you are pushing some of the infantry, say the heavy weapon squads, out on turn 1, maybe, to basically push the screen out. Yeah. And whilst I have also banged on the point that these aren't units that can score you a lot, I would say the heavy weapons squad, which is 3 bases, that definitely at 50 points could be used in turn 4 onwards if you're getting desperate to be chucked out and sort of either movement blocking your opponent, trying to turn off their objectives, or even scoring things like containment, cleanse, or area denial in the middle of the board. But do be really careful how you basically spread everything out. You should not be ever being deep strike, particularly if you're taking artillery, and even in the world of 6-inch deep strike, there should be no excuses, guardsmen, for allowing that to happen in your backfield. Now, maximising fire ranges, we've spoken about this already, I've sort of touched on that quite extensively, is this is as simple as basically understanding if my two's got a 48-inch maximum range, where does that cover on the entire tabletop? Now, it's relatively mathematically easy to understand, but certainly firing diagonally, you need to factor that. And likewise, if it's a lengthways deployment, you know, actually shooting across a 60-inch tabletop means that depending where you deploy it, there's basically 12 inches of safety for your opponent. And obviously in that instance, you need to push forward a couple of key units. And again, you know, you may need to actually deploy some of your artillery quite aggressively to actually make sure it's got the full coverage of your opponent's backfield. But of course, balance that with not leaving the back of your deployment zone completely exposed. Now, this is then a bit more into the actual sort of regiment, unit rules, orders, etc. Now, this has obviously it's got way more complex now. I've got the new codex, which is fantastic. And I'm not super close to it because I don't actually have the codex yet. I don't want to buy it until that actually you can buy it separately. But there are 2 regiments, I believe, which could basically benefit Astra Militarum Indirect, giving you reroll 1s from Bridgehead Strike Force. But also then you've got the Siege attachment where you could basically strip cover. And then that obviously is very, very beneficial because stripping cover means that suddenly your opponent doesn't get that cover save. And obviously rerolling 1s to hit mathematically means you're technically hitting on a 3.5, yeah? So if you're hitting on 4s, reroll 1s, obviously, you know, you've got a 16% chance of rolling a 1, and then you've got a 50% chance of rolling a 4 on that dice that was recycled. So that's now technically a 58% hit rate. So there's a bit of math for you. Yeah, so if you are going to take indirect, you want to broadly be always ensuring you've got some way to actually make them a bit more effective. Because, you know, over the course of 5 turns, that extra 8% will add up and basically mean more hit rolls and more wound rolls and more obviously failed saving throws. Now, again, unit rules, and I can only think of one off the top of my head, is, you know, the Scout Sentinel still gives everything it can see within 18 inches, real 1s to hit. So if you're not taking a regiment, which basically gives you real 1s to hit, is the Scout Sentinel your go-to unit to basically make sure that all the indirect that comes into that unit is basically going to be copying, hitting on 4s, reroll 1s. So what are you doing to make sure that you're actually a bit more accurate in that instance? Now, orders, interestingly, this now is actually more of a discussion point than it previously was. And the reason for that is I understand that the Basilisk, Manticore, and Wyvern have lost the heavy keyword. So again, this is getting into the rules a bit, but as we said, the best you can hit is a 4. And you also -1 hit as well, actually. So that basically means you will need to be receiving an order to basically make sure you're hitting on 4s, because all of the infantry stuff, like artillery team, the counter heavy weapon squad, they've got a ballistic skill 5+. They've then got the heavy keyword, which basically means you're hitting on 5s. Remove the -1 to hit from the indirect penalty. You then get +1 to hit from staying still via indirect. And then if you receive an order, you're hitting on 4. So I missed that at the start as basically indirect, you're hitting on 4s at best. You -1 to hit, and you give your opponent the benefits of cover. So that's something I missed there. But that means that certain units will need orders to basically be hitting on 4s, yeah? Because even the Basilisk, the Manticore, they've lost the heavy keyword. Ballistic skill 4+, -1 hit is hitting on a 5. A squadron order or a tank order, as you want to call it, hitting on 4s again. So again, you know, if you're going to take, let's say 6 indirect units, how are you making sure they can all receive an order of some description? But certainly within the new codex, it's much easier to get orders. Basically, all of the units that could give orders have basically got an additional order. Like, for example, tank commanders can give 2 orders, previously 1. Cadian Castellans can give 2, previously 1. And also, for example, Ursula Kree can now give 3, previously 2. So you want to be obviously making sure that units receive orders. But the thing is with Guard is that broadly orders are simply the bread and butter of this army. You know, you can operate this army without orders, but where this army gets very powerful is obviously via orders. And stratagems. I'm not going to talk about exactly which ones because I actually know them all too well, but what stratagems have you got across the wider book that allow you to be more effective? And, okay, the one example I can think of is Fields of Fire for 1 CP in the Combined Arms detachment, is how are you making sure you're getting extra AP. So that could also be, as I think about it, say for example, the Hellhound, it strips cover. So you strip cover, you then get a Scout Sentinel looking at it, again, real ones to hit. You then may also use Fields of Fire, so then your opponent is technically, they don't get a cover save, your real ones to hit, and let's say an indirect piece with AP2 is AP2 because they don't get cover. You get additional AP via Fields of Fire. Suddenly, a Space Marine goes from saving on a 3+ to a 6+. And then even you could put, say, the Limit Rush battle tank, Limit Rush Exterminator, the autocannon on top for extra AP. So you could basically stack things on top to make it a bit more effective. Yeah, so I think this is definitely one to think about, is how do you make it more effective. But again, broadly speaking, for damage dealing units, I would say this principle always applies, is how do you make sure what you're going to damage is going to die. Because as I said before, if you've played enough 40k, you will know all too well, guard shooting can be very hit and miss. There are some units which definitely are very, very powerful now, like the Tempestus Scions are very, very killy into infantry because you can get lots of rerolls, you can hit on 2s, for example, lethal hits, for example, blah, blah, blah. But definitely when things are hitting on 4s with D6+3, which is very swingy, that's when you want to make sure that you're maximizing the math to actually make it happen. Cool, the next one is then picking the right targets. Now, this is where it gets a bit, not necessarily technical, but this is when you want to be making sure you're obviously maximizing what you could actually kill. So I've got a couple of examples here. So the first one is creating gaps. Yeah, so this is going to be, when I say gaps, it could be weakening one part of your opponent's deployment. So if they've got maybe, a unit which is obviously going to go for the expansion objective, the objective they typically could go for on turn 2, how do you pick on them and basically take them from being 5 intercessors to 2, for example? Or maybe the gaps could be in the sense that if they've got a very powerful unit, which could do with loads of melee output, which isn't in a transport, just killing off maybe 1 or 2 of those models is enough to flip the mass that they're not necessarily guaranteed to kill a Luminous battle tank with all their power swords or thunder hammers, that type of thing. Now then it also obviously ties into exposing the backfield. Now the classic way to always use this is that if your opponents put some stuff, which they would have, on the home objective, you basically bombard them with artillery for 2 or 3 turns, destroy that unit and force them to basically do something about that, yeah? Because, you may, let's say if they've got some cultists, some squishy cultists worth, 80 points, and you kill those cultists, and then they have to put back a dreadnought, for example, to actually hold that objective. That's a fantastic use because you've basically not only removed a unit from their army, but you force another unit to basically go back and do nothing. Yeah, they've got to hold their home objective. Likewise, if you are taking Tempestus Aquilons or you're playing Scions and Bridgehead Strike Force where they can deep strike for 6 inches, do you basically pick on your opponent's back, that unit, basically blast them to bits, have 2 dudes left, and suddenly for your poor opponent to actually hold that objective and to basically ensure they can't be 6-inch deep struck, that could be definitely a way to do it. I do think there's always going to be a bit of a weird synergy between Indirect and Scions because anything which can deep strike loves basically big gaps your opponent's deployment zone or in the wider game space, and this is always going to be a nice way to do it, yeah. It's certainly this quite nasty one here. And definitely a combo which was exploited by competitive players when Aquilons could 3-inch deep strike, which was disgusting, but fun to play. Is imagine you could put Indirect into a unit, remove it from say 10 models to 7, drop in an Aquilon squad which has been screened out, use the Flamer on deployment to kill off a couple of models, then drop in the other Aquilon squad on the objective and take it off your opponent. So pretty tasty stuff, but 3-inch deep strike is gone. But definitely these two, again, you want to be sort of understanding how you can basically control the game by basically having your opponent having less stuff, yeah. Now, the obvious one is then if you pull Assassinate, no prisoners, overwhelming force, early on in the game, maybe turns 1 and 2, where you can't actually see direct line of sight, this is when indirect is fantastic, because again, if it's a lone character wandering around, like some sort of like Eldar Farseer or something, hit him with 2 artillery teams or 2 Ordnance Battery, they're probably going to kill it. And the other one, this is really just basic, but if you just want to strip away all this complex sort of theoretical stuff I've crafted together, you just kill stuff, yeah. And the key thing is here that you're killing stuff with no trade-off, because obviously indirect can't be seen most of the time. Your opponent can't interact with it. You're just blasting their models off the tabletop without them actually being able to do anything about it. So yeah. Right, and the other one is then definitely set up for the late play. So again, if you've spent 500 points in indirect, 1,000 points in indirect, which I don't think you should, and you've then got 1,000 points to go and play the rest of the game, is, you know, particularly in, say, I don't know, turn 4, if your opponent's got no more deep strike left, no more reserves left, no more uppy downy units, which are quite common now, they can, you know, go in the sky, drop down, is you start to push forward your actual indirect units, yeah, because as I said, a lot of the, obviously all the infantry key units, like artillery team, have weapon squads for ordnance batteries, you know, they move 4, granted, they move pretty slow for the big units, the big models. They're still infantry, they can move through walls, which is comical. And they can go sit on objectives. They can go and perform actions. So don't forget, you know, that they can still be used to play the game. Obviously, I focus a lot of this conversation on the fact that I don't play Interact to 40k. But again, the vehicles as well. You know, if you're coming into turn 4, and if you went second, this is always the key thing, if you went second and you score your primary at the end of the last turn, and you push out your Manticore and your Basilisk in turn 4, that means that come turn 5, you can actually go and contest an objective and take it off your opponent, for example, yeah? So definitely don't basically sort of just let these units relax, in inverted commas. I mean, they can be picked up and move forward and actually play a bit of 40k as opposed to just sitting there blowing stuff up in turn 4 and 5. But yeah, so this is obviously a lot more theoretical. Compared to the other videos where I go through TTS, it's obviously more illustrative, but I do think indirect is probably more conceptually something you've got to focus on. What actually, you know, what it does is pretty basic, but how do you maximize that basic thing it does to win your games? So in summary, these are the key points. It basically puts your opponent on the clock, because if you both did nothing all game, you would basically have more models than they do, because they would just lose all their stuff without you having to interact with them. They're not, of course, as said, and this is a very common guard statement, is they're not guaranteed to do any damage, however they can in the right scenario. The right scenario being supported by the right rules, stratagems, units, and into the right targets. And typically what we're looking for ideally is massive blobs of infantry, you know, blast 4, you know, got 20 models, don't have more than probably a 4-up save, maybe a 3-up, maybe a 5-up save ideally. And ideally, you know, more than a toughness 5, ideally, because then you're always going to be winning on 4s at minimum. And this, of course, comes into list composition, is that you want to be balancing the points you invest into indirect units with units that will play the actual game. Yeah, so again, you know, particularly with Bridgehead Strike Force, for example, because I know it relatively well, is obviously going to take loads of scions. So if you took a little package of indirect and you've got scions to exploit the gaps that are created, what are you basically going to have on the board on turns 1 and 2 that basically means that your opponent can't just bum rush you and squish you into the deployment zone? So again, if you go and dump 1,000 points into indirect units, what is that remaining 1,000 points going to do to actually play the game of 40k? So yeah, hopefully interesting and helpful. A shorter one. Let me check how long I spoke for. Hopefully not too long. 30 minutes. Gosh, how did I cover 30 minutes of this? But yeah, I definitely think indirect, you know, again, I think we've come a long way, and I think it's good, is back in the beginning of 10th edition, we're hitting on 201s via Scout Sentinel. It wasn't fun for the game. It was awful to play into. They've removed it, make it significantly less effective. There still definitely is a home for indirect for Astra Militarum. We probably have some of the cheapest and most effective-ish indirect in the game, I'd say. That's a broad statement. So certainly a home for it. Is it going to win you games? No. If you went 1,000 points, I don't think that you probably would necessarily do well, but obviously into the right matchups you can. So any questions, let me know. Any comments, let me know. If you enjoy this video, please tell me. It's always good to get positive feedback. And yeah, as I said, this is less about what the units actually do themselves, but what this unit type does in totality, yeah? So yeah, if you enjoyed this video and want to support me, you can do so with a like, comment, or by subscribing, or simply watching any of my other YouTube videos. As I said, I cover lore, tactics, and the hobby as well. I also do loads of YouTube shorts where I focus on a lot of Warhammer Dark Tide, a PC game I play way too much of, a real slash and burn game. And I really support the Patreon support and also the channel members out there, because it really motivates me to make more videos in amongst a busy life, being a young dad and also busy with my work life. So super thanks as always. Keep your bayonet sharp, let's go Nord. Fair for the Emperor strong. Patreon platoon, sound off. Tank Commander Glenn. Tank Commander Mitchell. Tank Commander Watchdog Van Etten. Lieutenant Burke Nielsen. Lieutenant Smith. Colour Sergeant DuPont. Sergeants Adal, Scott, the Colonel Merrill. Veteran Gibson, Hall, Lundeen. Guardsman Beard, Coquelin, Easing, Wood, Hills, Malik, Nitton, Nguyen, Tompkin. Conscript England, Evan Gunn, Goodwin. Honorary members Bolgram King, Psyche Smith, Tempestus Cyan Gaylard.